Hello, it's December 14th, 2023. I'm Jack McCotter,
I'm Peter Helsmus.
and Drew's behind the camera, and we're going to be interviewing Dan McCotter on an interview about his life in Milwaukee. Alright, hello,
Hi,
welcome back. We know you're alumni of Marquette.
I am, class of '85.
Alright, so let's just start off by a little knowledge of your childhood. So, where did you live as a child, and what was that like?
I grew up in Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin, and corner of Hampton and Berkeley. So it was a pretty quiet suburban neighborhood. Went to Holy Family grade school. So we had a pretty active block with a lot of kids growing up. So it was a good place to live.
Alright. And then, did you have like a sense of community within your neighborhood, and do you have any stories from back then?
We did. I think I went to Holy Family grade school, so there was definitely a parish community. So a lot of the neighbor kids went to school there as well. So I went to Cumberland, the public school that was in walking distance, but everybody hung out together. So there was the neighborhood community, and then we also had a pretty tight-knit parish community too.
Then you mentioned you went up to the UP for part of each summer, and you came back to Milwaukee. Can you explain, were there any like big differences that you saw within that experience?
Yep, I mean Milwaukee, it's definitely city living. The UP of Michigan is pretty rural and remote, so our lifestyle up there was very different. Here it was school and work and running around on the block. Up in the UP we had a little cottage on the lake. Early on we stayed in a property that my great-grandfather had built. He used to work up in the, my mom's family was from up in the UP. He used to work in the iron ore mines, then he retired and built a small resort, so we stayed there in the early years, and then we had another small cottage on another lake, and we also had a hobby farm up there, so we had horses and cows, pigs, 200 chickens, had rabbits, so we raised quite a few animals and had a big garden. So yeah, living in the UP was very different. It was a little bit of a farm life, and Milwaukee was certainly city living.
Then you mentioned that you went to Holy Family
Yes,
school.
Holy Family School, yeah.
Was there a community within that parish?
Yeah, for sure. There was the church community and then the school community. So I think at the time grade school basketball was a big thing, at least in the Catholic schools. So there was certainly a Catholic basketball league and some tournaments, the old St. Vincent de Paul tournament. There was the, I should say, St. Peter and Paul tournament on the east side. So all the parishes kind of interacted with one another, and Holy Family was a pretty tight-knit group.
And before we go into your high school, do you have any stories, any extra stories about your childhood around like where you lived, your elementary school, grade school, or middle school?
Gosh, stories. We just used to run around pretty crazy. Things were safe at the time, so all the kids were running up and down the block. A lot of driveway basketball for sure. We were right along Estherbrook Park, so we used to run over to the park quite a bit and hang out in Estherbrook. But I think, yeah, that's pretty much what we did.
Was your neighborhood the type where you would leave your doors open?
Yeah, it was certainly a safe neighborhood. I mean, we felt very secure and safe. As we were talking about a little earlier, kids were running in and out of everybody's houses, and it was pretty mixed age-wise. So younger kids were hanging out with older kids, and a lot of wiffle ball, a lot of football in the street, a lot of basketball in the driveways, so that was the kind of thing that we were doing. But yeah, it was safe and secure and a good place to grow up.
And then, as you moved on to high school, what high school did you attend?
As we talked about earlier, went to Marquette High School, graduated in 1985.
And have you seen any like changes in the school itself since then?
Yeah, I think I haven't spent a lot of time here since back then, but from my limited experience, I think it's pretty similar. Seems to be a pretty similar student body, similar community for sure. I think your facilities are a lot nicer now, as we talked about in the pre-interview. Had a lot of generous alumni and donors to help, modernize the school. So it's a lot more modern now, a lot nicer, a lot more with the times. Say one big difference, I think there were quite a few more Jesuits here when I was here in 1985. But overall, it seems to have the same vibe.
Well, did you participate in any clubs or activities at Marquette?
I did. I was stage manager for 2 years. So I was pretty involved from freshman year on, working on stage crew, and then eventually was stage manager under the direction of Father Tom Brennan, who became a good friend. He and Charlie Stang, who passed away not too long ago. So they were good friends, so I got to know them and took over as stage manager and worked with them. Did the morning announcements for 1 year. It was involved with student government. I don't know if they still call it conclave.
They do.
They do. So I forget exactly what years I was involved in that, but those are the main activities that I was involved in.
How did you commute to Marquette?
Freshman year, we had a carpool, so there were, I think, four or five of us that carpooled. So one of the parents would drive us to school in the morning, and then we took the city bus back home. So it was tradition at the time. Nobody really wanted to take the city bus, so people would hang out in the parking lot trying to bum rides home from upperclassmen that were headed back their way. So sometimes that's how you got home. Other than that, taking the city bus. So I used to pick up the bus at 27th in Wisconsin, and we'd have to transfer when we got further east, but the bus went down Wisconsin Avenue. We kind of weaved around the east side along what used to be what was called the Park East Corridor, and take Humboldt Avenue up to Wilson Drive, and then Wilson, and hop off there and walk the rest of the way. So.
All right. How were the buses back then?
They were pretty busy, so they were safe and pretty clean and pretty busy. So they weren't as predictable, I don't think, in time. Now that you have apps, you can tell exactly where they are and when they're going to pick you up. So there's a little more mystery involved waiting for the bus, but they were good. I think probably comparable to how they are now.
And then, did you have a job growing up around this time?
I did. I had a job. My first job was working at Food Lane, which was a grocery store about a block and a half from our house. So I started as a grocery bagger, and ultimately worked my way up to assistant produce manager. So I did that on Saturdays and Sundays when I was in town in Market High. So we started about 5:30 in the morning on Saturday and Sunday in the produce department. So had the pleasure of getting up early and cutting vegetables and getting them all out for the store that opened at 7. So that was my first job, and had a whole series of interesting jobs growing up.
All right. Were there any more jobs around this time, or was that farther past high school?
High school, that was pretty much, again, when I wasn't up north in the UP, I had different jobs up there, but in high school, in Milwaukee, that was my predominant job.
And then, around your childhood, did you have any common restaurants or places that you went with your family in Milwaukee?
We used to go to the Shorewood Inn in Shorewood quite a bit. We were in Whitefish Bay, but it wasn't too far. And they used to have a bus that you'd go and have dinner, and then the bus would take you down to the old Mecca. We had season tickets for the Marquette University games, so we have dinner at the Shorewood Inn, excuse me, and then take the bus down to the Marquette games.
We had conversations in class about the Mecca and the controversy surrounding it. What was your opinion on that?
Well, you're talking about the floor?
Yeah, the floor.
Yeah, the floor, that was the first of its kind. The Mecca floor. Prior to that, every floor was just a parquet or a wood floor with basic lines. So, yeah, I remember at the time it was a big deal. That's when the Bucks were playing there, and Marquette University was playing there. And yeah, I forget the name of the artist, but he became pretty famous, and I know it's now at the Milwaukee Art Center. But it was groundbreaking, which I guess you didn't see a lot of that in Milwaukee, so it was cool.
All right, and then
I didn't have a specific opinion whether I was for or against it at the time, but I do remember it being controversial for sure.
And then, did you have any more places you went with your family, or was that it?
We did. We talked about it a little bit in the pre-interview. We used to go to a place called the Pig and Whistle, which was a kind of a classic drive-in. I know I'd asked you guys before, you had heard of Happy Days, but it's supposedly the hangout that Arnold's from Happy Days was based on. So it was always kind of interesting that Happy Days was set in Milwaukee. It was probably the biggest sitcom at the time when we were growing up, and so that being the Arnold's and the university, I think in the show they called it the University of Wisconsin or University of Milwaukee, but that being UWM would have been on the east side. And I think Mr. Cunningham, the parent of the family, had a hardware store. So again, all those, in our mind, that was always the hardware store on Downer Avenue. And that the Cunninghams always probably lived near the university on Newberry, where there were a lot of big houses and coach houses and garages behind where, you know, Arthur Fonzarelli or the Fonz probably lived. So it was neat having that being set in Milwaukee back at a time when, you know, Milwaukee was a blue-collar, meat and potatoes 1950s town. So, but it wasn't too off in terms of the vibe they were trying to get across in the show. Of course, the show was sensationalized and scripted, but it was kind of cool.
So you feel that the show's representation of Milwaukee was pretty accurate?
I think it was reflective of a time in the 1950s when things were different and kind of classically American. So I think it wasn't too far off. Certainly it was Hollywood, but it was you know, the spin-off show Laverne and Shirley. They worked at the brewery, the Schatz Brewery in Milwaukee. So it's interesting because I travel a little bit for business, and I go to Italy and some other countries, and they must have syndicated the shows because all the Italians and a lot of people know about Milwaukee from watching Laverne and Shirley and Happy Days. So it's kind of interesting after all this time. That's what they see of Milwaukee. Certainly that's changed.
Yeah.
I think Milwaukee's image has changed over the years from beer, bowling, and bratwursts to a much more progressive town of arts and culture. So.
And you said that Milwaukee's changed. You gave us some specific examples. Could you give us like a broader?
Yeah, from in the '80s when I was growing up, it was, again, Milwaukee was a blue-collar beer town. It was really, truly known for bowling and bratwurst and beer, and I think things just started to change in the I'd say the mid-'80s was a critical time. A couple of major things happened. I think one of the biggest changes in Milwaukee around that time was when they developed the Grand Avenue Mall. I remember growing up with going shopping downtown around Christmas time to Gimbel's, which is still, the building is still there on the corner of Wisconsin and I guess between Michigan and Wisconsin, right on the river. But Gimbel's was the big department store downtown. But I remember going down there, and there wasn't really a mall. A lot of businesses had moved out, and downtown Wisconsin Avenue had gotten a little bit seedy. So them investing in building the Grand Avenue Mall, I think that was, I don't know, I guess 81 or 82, I think was a major catalyst to people starting to focus downtown. At the time, everything had moved out to was moving out to the suburbs, and there was a real loss of city center feel. So I think Grand Avenue was a major change to the downtown area. So that was one. I think over the years another huge change was the development of the Riverwalk. I think that was in the early 90s. That was Mayor, you guys probably don't know John Norquist, but he was the mayor at the time. Very forward-thinking mayor, very a new urbanist, I guess is what they called him. Had a pretty good understanding of how European cities worked, and I think with Milwaukee's culture of being European and some of the political history, I think had a vision for trying to re-energize downtown, benefits of population density. I think he was transformative. So he was a mayor for a long time, and he had the idea of developing the Riverwalk, try and draw investment, business downtown, and a lot of people kind of laughed at it, thought it was a joke, but obviously it was a huge catalyst to really reinvigorating downtown. I know at one point the river downtown was so smelly and polluted they had actually talked about putting a concrete cap over it, which would have been a travesty. So instead they went the other direction and decided to clean it up and fix it up, and it was a huge change to the city. So I think that was a major change for the good. In fact, I know at one point I remember Chicago, Mayor Daley from Chicago and some of the city fathers from Chicago came up to Milwaukee to see our Riverwalk, and they actually copied it. So Milwaukee was the first to develop like that.
So in the pre-interview, you mentioned that your father worked at and co-owned McCotter and Hanson Incorporated. Did you ever go with him to work, and what was it like? Yeah,
it was, it started in 1956, and it was McCotter and Sons. So my grandfather, Howard, my uncle, Larry, and my dad started the company. So they started selling, my great-grandfather was actually a engineer on the railroad. So he was on the Rock Island Railroad in Chicago. So I started out as a fireman, so he used to shovel coal into the engines. So he started as a fireman, shoveling coal into these old locomotive engines, basically a rolling steam boiler. So he retired as an engineer. I don't know, through serendipity or just history, my grandfather, who started the business with my dad and my uncle, he was a salesman for a company called Riley Coal Stoker. And Riley Coal Stoker, they had automated augers and hoppers that used to deliver coal into boilers. So he left Riley Coal Stoker, and they started McCotter and Sons, selling gas and oil burners that were, used to fire boilers with coal and the coal stokers, and got into it that way. So the company, which actually I'm now president and owner of, dates back, I guess, really to kind of the steam locomotive engine and coal and creating steam that way. So we still do it with modern, more efficient technologies, but that's the history of the company. But the company started, their first office was on 27th and Wells, not far from here. And then they moved to Lisbon Avenue. And when I was a kid, the office was on Lisbon. So I used to go on Saturdays. I used to go with my dad. He'd go to the office, get the mail, and see if there are any checks in it or whatever. But the routine that we had developed, I'd go to the office with him. And at the time, and I must have been 8, 10, 12 years old, I don't know. When we were kids, a big hobby or trend was kids would have beer can collections. So, and like whole basements full of beer cans lined up on the wall. So hundreds and hundreds of beer cans. So what I used to do on Saturdays, I'd go to my dad to the office on Lisbon. Right next door was a liquor store. So we'd go, he'd do his work, we'd walk over to the liquor store, and I'd get to pick out one can of beer. And I would just pick out whatever beer I wanted for my beer can collection. So then we'd go home and have ham and rolls, which is a pretty strong Milwaukee tradition, hot ham and rolls. So he would have his beer, and we both eat ham sandwiches. I'd wait for him to finish, and then I'd take the can, clean it out, and add it to my beer can collection. So I think he probably drank a lot of bad beers just because I wanted the can for the collection. So anyway, those are my earliest memories of going to the company. But eventually moved. We're now downtown off Brady Street.
I actually have a personal glass bottle collection.
Oh,
so
cool.
I think it's cool that we have similar interests.
What kind of bottles?
Soda bottles,
Okay, cool.
glass ones.
All different countries, different...
Different countries, different sizes, yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, it was I mean, you could probably ask any person my age, and they probably had a collection of beer cans, and yeah, that's cool. Where do you keep all yours?
My dresser.
You do? All right, awesome.
What was your favorite one?
Oh, man. I had yeah, of course, you had all the Milwaukee beers, which were easy. And at the time, this goes back, gosh, even a little bit before my time, they used to have, they were cone tops. So the can, it was a cylindrical can, and they had a cone top and a bottle cap on the top. So those were always a good collector. And then Schmidt beer had a whole series, so they would, because they knew people were collecting these cans, they had a whole wildlife series. There must have been 30 different wildlife scenes that Schmidt used to be on their beers, so everyone tried to collect the entire series. There was one called Old Frothing Slosh, which was a Pennsylvania beer, and they had a whole series of cans with like a beauty pageant on the side, although the contestants weren't all that attractive. So anyway, those are a couple of memories from the old beer can collection.
All right, and then so you mentioned your mom worked as a nurse.
Yes.
Anything you'd like to share about that?
Yeah. She well, I think it relates to Milwaukee. My mom's family grew up on 13th and Silver Spring, roughly, a couple blocks in off of Silver Spring. So she went to St. Nicholas grade school and parish. That's where I was actually baptized there. And then went to Mesmer High School, and then went on to Northern Michigan College for her studies and nursing degree, and came back, and then she was a nurse at St. Mary Hospital, where I was born, on North Avenue and basically Lake Drive. So that was her kind of trajectory in Milwaukee. And then my dad's family was from the east side, grew up on Marietta Boulevard. They had moved up from Chicago when my dad was very young, and lived on Marietta and Shepherd Avenue on the east side. So they were a little bit further east, but that's really where my family started in Milwaukee.
And then in the pre-interview, we asked if you had any artifacts from your early year. You mentioned about a World War II case you forgot to bring in.
On Marietta, it's interesting because my Uncle Larry was old enough that he served in World War II, and I guess, memorabilia from the east side, it's still address, his Foot Locker from World War II is shipped back via mail, and it's addressed to my grandfather, Howard S. McCotter, and it's got their address on Marietta, so they shipped all his goods and everything back to their east side location on Marietta. So it's kind of cool to have. I have that with their old address growing up. You know, piece of memorabilia from way back when that ties them to the east side.
And then just finishing up your childhood, did your grandparents live around Milwaukee or in the area?
Yeah, like I said, my dad's family grew up on Marietta and Shepherd, so they grew up there. My mom's family was from the UP of Michigan, so my great-grandparents on my mom's side were from the UP. My grandparents were from there as well, but then ended up moving to 13th and Silver Spring.
And do you have any memories from their house, their neighborhoods?
Yeah, I remember the east side well. In fact, I always kind of felt like home. So where they were was not far from Downer Avenue. So we used to walk over to, there was a Century store on Downer Avenue, the grocery store there. The Downer Theater was there. They had, Sendix was on Downer even back then. So we used to spend some time on the east side. So I've got a lot of memories of walking there with my grandma. So it was a nice neighborhood, neat old home, so did that. On the other side, I have memories with my grandfather. We used to have a routine. The ones that lived on Silver Spring, we used to have a routine. Once a month, we would go get our hair cut over on basically Silver Spring and Green Bay Avenue, and there was a pet store next to the barber shop, so we'd always go and look at the pets. And then we'd go to a bar that was on Green Bay Avenue called the Suburbanite, and my grandpa would get, he was a little bit of Italian heritage, so he would get a shot of anisette, and I'd get a little root beer. So that was one of my memories with my grandparents over on their neighborhood. So.
All right. So that's kind of finishing up your childhood as you moved on in your life and started to go to college.
Yep.
Did you attend a college, and if so, what college?
I did. I went to St. Norbert College, so I got a degree in business administration and political science, St. Norbert. So graduated from St. Norbert in 1989.
And where was St. Norbert College?
Green Bay area, De Pere, so just outside of Green Bay. So a lot smaller town than Milwaukee, nice town, but certainly a different vibe. Didn't have the metropolitan feel, and didn't have a lot of the same things to offer as Milwaukee, but it was a good town.
What was the community like there?
It was. Yeah, there were a lot of paper mills up in the Fox Valley in Green Bay, so there was it was similar to Milwaukee in that it was an industrial base, so a lot of jobs are based on in industry. But again, just a smaller town. I think Green Bay at the time the whole area may have had 100,000, 150,000 people. You know, Milwaukee at the time was metro area was about 1.7 million. So different field, but definitely was Wisconsin. It was nice place.
All right, and then so you mentioned that you lived a few different places after college, stating that Third Ward was the first one. What was that like?
At the time, very different than the Third Ward today. So yeah, we out of college, myself and some roommates, we moved in. I'm not sure how we found the place, but we moved to the Third Ward. So it was 236 North Water Street. At the time, the building was called the Jack Pack Building. So the Jack Pack was a company that imported a bunch of very cheap, kind of knockoff Chinese toys. So Sue Cohen and her dad, I forget her dad's name, but they ran the business. So they had a big warehouse on one side of Water Street. We lived in a 4-story building on the other side, but it was pretty much an empty warehouse. So we had the entire 3rd floor that we built out our apartments. Used to go up in a freight elevator. But the 3rd ward at that time was not a neighborhood. It was really an industrial part of the city. There were a lot of empty warehouses, but Jack Pack was there, the Hofko Shoe Company was there and active. Broadway, we were talking a little bit earlier about it. Broadway was the hub of the produce industry in Milwaukee. So the produce would come in to Milwaukee into the 3rd ward, and all of Broadway, you can still see some of the architectural remnants were all cold storage for produce. So all the Italian families, the Balistraries, Gloriosos, Tony Macchi's, all the Italian families own the grocery distributorships. So at any given day, you'd be down there. We were living there, but they were still running forklifts up and down the middle of the street, and trucks and loading them up. So it was an interesting vibe, very different than the restaurants and retail that are there now. So, initially the 3rd ward was an Italian neighborhood Irish neighborhood way back in the day. And after the fire, for whatever reason, I know it became very Italian down there, and that's where they established all their produce businesses. So that was, on its last legs when we were living down there. There weren't very many restaurants. I think there was one bakery called La Boulangerie. That was there. You could get some bakery and breakfast. And then there was another Greasy Spoon restaurant, kind of a diner called the Broadway Grill, and that was owned by an Italian guy, nice guy, Blaze Cantonese. So those were a couple of the only real restaurants that they had at the time, but I'd say there's probably 24 restaurants now. So a little different than now.
And then, so you also mentioned in the pre-interview, after this time, you went to a tannery. What was this tannery called, and what was it like?
Oh, we moved to, from Water Street. We found another warehouse further down into Walker's Point. So that was at 6th in Virginia. It was a Pfister and Vogel tannery. So we were the first real residential tenants in what was a huge, old, somewhat dilapidated tannery. So, at the time, that's one big difference in Milwaukee between now and then. In the 80s and prior, I don't know if you guys know this, but the Milwaukee around the turn of the century was a huge leather producing city. So from downtown, roughly where McKinley Avenue is today, all the way up to Humboldt, wall to wall, it was literally almost one continuous building. They were all brick buildings, and those were all the tanning facilities. Pfister and Vogel was there, the Galloon Tannery, Western Leather Tannery. Pfister and Vogel had another, actually 2 other locations. They had one on downtown, and then they had a tannery complex that was way south, down near where Barnacle Buds is and Skipper Buds is on the river. And then they had the one at 6th in Virginia. So we moved into the Pfister and Vogel Tannery. Kind of had a homesteaded early loft apartment there, so that was pretty cool. But yeah, Milwaukee had Flag Tanning, Seidel Tanning, Pfister and Vogel, Galloon Tannery, Black Hawk Tanning. Gosh, there were a ton of them. Western Leather. So it was, but again, you couldn't look around downtown or in Walker's Point without seeing tannery complexes. Now they're apartments, condos along the river.
Right, and then just
So after that, you said you lived in a coach house on Lake Drive.
We did, yeah.
How was it living there?
It was cool. It was certainly different than living in a big loft warehouse, but a lot of history. The house, the coach house I lived in was behind a kind of a mansion, and the mansion was owned by, it was built by, I don't know if you guys know where Schuster's, you ever talk about Schuster's down on Mitchell Avenue? Schuster's had a department store, and Schuster's was, the owner of Schuster's built this mansion for his daughter, gave it to her as a wedding gift. So back in the day, that was, I guess, what they did. So I, of course, couldn't afford the mansion, but I lived above the garage and the coach house in the back, so it was nice. But it was, again, east side where I wanted to be. It's where my family heritage was. So it was good to be back over that way.
All right. So we're back. We just talked about the coach house on Lake Drive, but now after that, you said you moved to a Civil War era building in Port Washington with a candy store in the front and an office upstairs.
Yeah. So after I was in the coach house, I know I wanted to buy a building, place to live, and I would have bought on Brady Street, but couldn't afford it at the time. So ended up really like Port Washington. I'm kind of a nautical guy, and found a building up there. It was as you mentioned, a Civil War era building, so it was an old storefront on Franklin Street. So I renovated that inside and out and lived upstairs, and then I had my office. At the time I was working with McCotter and Hansen at the time, and had my office in part of the lower half of the building. I had it rented out, built out for a candy store in the front, and lived upstairs. So yeah, so that was like 1997, I guess, is when I moved up to Port Washington. So it was a cool little harbor town.
That's nice. And then, this was when I was alive too, but you moved to the east side of east side Milwaukee,
Yes.
2004.
It was 2004, I guess it was, yeah. So we, at the time, met my wife, and we ended up getting married, and we moved to our first house was on Murray Avenue between Linwood and Kenwood, just south of UWM. So yeah.
I know you never really directly lived in Milwaukee before this, so did you see any or you lived on the east side of Milwaukee before this, so did you see any differences between 3rd Ward, Port Washington, Lake Drive, places like this?
Oh yeah.
In the east side?
For sure, yeah. Very different. Downtown in a very industrial feel at the time. It wasn't, Third Ward wasn't gentrified like it is now. Port Washington was a small harbor town, small town. It felt very much like being in a different part of Wisconsin, even though it was only about 25 minutes north. So that was very different. The east side was pretty much how I remembered it, from the days of spending time there with my grandparents, but east side at the time was getting pretty busy with UWM was taking over a lot of houses, a lot of students. So it had definitely a college neighborhood feel to it. So those would be the major differences.
All right, and then you noted that one of your noteworthy experiences was the '82 World Series. Can you just,
yeah.
Can you just tell us a little bit about how that experience was and how the Brewers shaped Milwaukee?
Well, the Brewers.
Or the Braves.
They weren't the Braves when I was here. They came back in I think 72 or 73. I think they came back as the Brewers. So I mean, yeah, Milwaukee was definitely a baseball town. So everybody loved the Brewers. So we had some great teams when I was growing up. I guess one of the best teams they've had ever was the '82. So Paul Molitor, Robin Yount, Cecil Cooper, Pete Vukovich, Raleigh Fingers. So they had some of the classics. But yeah, '82. So that was they played the St. Louis Cardinals in the World Series, and games were played at County Stadium, which was very different than Miller Park, certainly not as flashy. But unfortunately, the Brewers ended up losing to the St. Louis Cardinals. But I remember, even though they lost, they had a homecoming parade for the Brewers, and I was at Market High at the time. And they let us out of school so we could all go down to the parade. But I remember the parade went down Wisconsin Avenue, and all the players were sitting on the back ledge of the convertibles driving down Wisconsin Avenue. I remember Pete Vukovich and gosh, I don't remember who else was in his car, but they were in the back, and I remember being in the front row, and everyone was high-fiving as they went by, and I remember looking into the floor of the car. They were sitting in the back ledge with their feet on the seat, and the whole floor of the car was filled with empty beer cans. So they were drowning their sorrows apparently on the parade route, but that was a pretty fond memory. And then I think they had some kind of homecoming at County Stadium, and I remember Robin Yount came out in a dirt bike. He had a motorcycle dirt bike, and he was peeling around the warning track all the way around, spinning out. So it was. They didn't win, but I still have some pretty fond memories.
And if you could use one word to describe this experience and like the environment, like electric, something like that, what would you say?
I was certainly proud. I mean, I just think Milwaukee was proud of the fact that their team made it to the World Series. It was a big deal, and it still is a big deal. Would have been better if they won, but the fact that they made it and had such a classic team. You talk to any of my high school classmates, and we all remember that entire team, and what positions they played, and remember that experience. So it was something we still talk about.
All right, so in the pre-interview, you mentioned the economic impact of the Carter and Reagan years.
Yeah, I think you had asked about, had talked about just
the impact it had on McCotter Energies.
Yeah. So growing up, I mean, the Carter years it was tough times, and there was a lot of, not too dissimilar from now. Inflation, I mean, it was after Watergate, which I remember even as a kid. Inflation was climbing. It was after the Vietnam War, and it was coming out of a turbulent time. Economically, we were in a big recession. There was an energy crisis, which I still remember waiting. They were rationing gas. Everybody they lowered the speed limit to save gas. They were asking people to turn down their thermostats due to the energy crisis, and interest rates were high. We grew up in a very middle class family with a small business, and it had a pretty big impact. It was a lot of worry, and things. There was a period of time there where things were looking pretty grim. Things, Carter finished out with one term, and Reagan came in, and the Iran hostage crisis was going on under the Carter administration, so that was a big deal historically. So it was just that time period, not necessarily all due to Carter, but that time period was just really kind of a downswing. And then in the early 80s, the economic times shifted, and the hostage crisis ended. Reagan was an eternal optimist, and I just think part of the cyclical swings of things. 80s were really kind of a boom time. When I was in high school, things were changing. So yeah, but the ebbs and flows of growing up in with a dad that owned a small business, you definitely felt the economic impacts of current events and of the economic cycles.
All right, and then you said you had a few jobs like truck mechanic, bartender. You built decks. you just give us a little background on how you got those jobs and how Milwaukee provided like opportunities?
Sure. Gosh, so I said, like I said, when I was up north, in the summer times, I had different jobs up in the UP. So in Milwaukee, I worked at the grocery store up there. I was where I was a truck mechanic, and I built homes with my cousin in the UP and did that sort of thing. So most of my those jobs were up in the UP. After college, I should say during college, when I was in town here too, I bartended a little bit. So worked at O'Donoghue's Pub on Blue Mountain Avenue, right across from the stadium. So I used to bartend there, and a few other places, the Highland House. So.
Did you have any like positive experiences with the Milwaukee people coming in there?
Well, not all bartending experiences are positive, but it was interesting. That was back in the day of used to bartend some lunch times, and that was back in the day of the 3 martini lunch. So there were a lot of business people and people from downtown that used to come to O'Donoghue's and have lunch. And so yeah, we were busy pouring Manhattans and martinis. But but for the most part, you got a lot of good information. There were some regulars that came in that were old classic Milwaukeeans. So, but it was a pretty high-end lunch place. So.
What developments in your lifetime do you think impacted Milwaukee the most?
Well, I think, like I said, I think a turning point for Milwaukee, I mentioned earlier, was the Grand Avenue Mall, the Riverwalk. I think those were 2 huge catalyst projects. That Riverwalk helped develop the 3rd Ward, in Walker's Point the way we see it now in downtown. I think one of the biggest, kind of an unseen development, I would say, is probably the Deep Tunnel project. I think that was the early 90s. They started the Deep Tunnel. When I was a kid, the Milwaukee sewer systems, both the sanitary and the storm sewers are combined. So whenever there were big storms, there'd be a huge release of raw sewage into Lake Michigan, where we get our drinking water. So I think as a quiet but huge infrastructure project, I think the deep tunnel, certainly for keeping Lake Michigan clean, was a huge deal. So that was the 90s, but I think we had part of Milwaukee history. We had a huge cryptosporidium outbreak. God, that was probably again around the early 90s. That the reason we had that is we were discharging a lot of raw sewage in the lake, miles from where we were drawing it back in. So I think from the quality of life and the quality of one of the best natural assets in the world, I think the Deep Tunnel project was probably a major, quiet but major development in Milwaukee. They built the Bradley Center. That again was the mid to early 80s. Bradley Center was a huge deal at the time. We talked about the Mecca earlier. The Mecca was an old and tired facility at the time, and building the Bradley Center was a huge deal. Those are a few of the big development projects that I can think of. Knocking out the Park East corridor, I talked about that. As far as changing really a lot of things downtown. So I think it was the 70s. As they were expanding the highway system, they had built the Hone Bridge, which is still there, and the plan was, and they had actually purchased land and raised a whole bunch of properties to build what was going to be I-794. So that ran from really where the Marquette interchange is now, between Ogden and I think Lion Street, all the way from roughly where MSOE is, all the way to the lakefront. They bought blocks and blocks and blocks of property, and they knocked it all down. And they were gonna build a freeway that connected and then ran along the east side of downtown and connected to the home bridge. But there was a ton of resistance to it, so all my time at Market High, there was just this huge swath of vacant land that cut through the it's called the Lower East Side. So that was pretty big deal. Eventually, over time, they developed it, but that sat empty for a really long time. So I think the decision to stop that highway and eventually to develop that land was a huge deal. Some of it still is empty from when they knocked down a shorter portion of that I-794. So yeah,
Right.
that was a major impact, I'd say.
And then, it's kind of, but, out of like, what's some of, or one or some of the most unique experiences you've had in Milwaukee?
Well, I think the Brewers World Series was certainly memorable and unique. I think one job I had was working on the inland lakes, the Lafarge cement boats. When I was at St. Norbert College, I used to offload cement on cement boats on the weekends sometimes. So they'd come in and we'd offload either cement from a silo onto a steamship or from a steamship into the silos. Our McCotter and Hansen had converted some of the boilers of the Lafarge, the inland lakes fleet, from coal to oil. So we had a relationship with them, so I got some odd work from them, not in Milwaukee, but these boats traveled the Great Lakes. But one of the more unique experiences I had was, it was when I was a kid. I think it was probably 11 or 12. It was 1979. The E.M. Ford, which is one of the oldest steamships ever to run on the on Lake Michigan, was parked on Christmas Eve. It was in the outer harbor, and they had a skeleton crew because of the holiday, and they had 5 people on it. So that ship actually ended up sinking at the dock in the outer harbor, and because we were working on the boilers. What's up?
Well, you mentioned that in the pre-interview, so
Yeah.
We were planning on talking about that later in the interview.
Okay, all right.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. You can edit that out, right?
Yeah.
And then, yeah.
So you would ask me about unique experiences in Milwaukee,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So-
We're gonna ask you, we're gonna say like one particular life story about Milwaukee
Oh.
and finish off with
Are we
that.
doing an hour?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we got 16 minutes left.
So we had 35.
But it's at 17 right now, but we just have like that 1
I
minute
think
left.
we, oh yeah, you're right.
So we got 16 minutes.
Alright, yeah, that's fine. I
All right.
guess.
Alright.
All right, so scratch that story till later. All right.
Audio sync. So, did you have any experiences with, well, you said you had experience with Gary Bruno. Could you describe that?
Oh, yeah. Gary was so through our business, Bruno was a major mechanical contractor, so we've done business with him over time. And Gary was, for those that know Milwaukee, he was a guy that was definitely a mover and shaker in Milwaukee and made things happen. I think we had talked about people in Milwaukee that were influential when I was growing up in my early business days. But so I would say he was a guy that was a city father, so to speak, and he did a lot to help Milwaukee. I know he was involved in pushing for the Grand Avenue, the Schlitz Park. I don't know if you know where the Schlitz Park is, along the river. That was the old Schlitz Brewery. He was instrumental in converting that from an empty brewery to an office park. So he was an interesting guy, did a lot for the city. So yeah, it was a good guy to know, and just there were always things happening when he was around.
Alright, and then you also mentioned Michael Cudahy.
Yeah, I had another guy I had the pleasure of meeting, and for those that are familiar with Milwaukee, Mike Cudahy started GE Electronics. It was Marquette Electronics at the time, and he became a philanthropist, so I guess felt honored to have a chance to meet some of those guys who I think are legends in terms of helping Milwaukee develop and be a place that it is today.
Alright, and then in the pre-interview we talked about your view on like the change in image in Milwaukee, and you said that you had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think I touched on it earlier, but growing up, Milwaukee was, the South was developing, and they referred to the where we are now, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Detroit, other northern cities as the Rust Belt, and that industry was moving out, they were moving south, and there was some truth to it. But at that point, Milwaukee, the image I think was it was a tired, old Rust Belt city, an industrial town, blue collar. We had our 4 breweries, and it was kind of a dying town. And some industry had left, but I think that image, we're still, I think, a town with a great work ethic, and a town that still is a working class town, which I think is a good thing. But I think Milwaukee's image has transformed through developments downtown, the Riverwalk, Milwaukee Art Museum, the Bucks, and is more of a jewel. I think people now come here and they visit from other cities, and they're pleasantly surprised. So I think that image of beer, brats, and bowling has certainly broadened to really a vibrant city. I think Milwaukee's embraced the lake, the Great Lake, and the river, and it's, like I said, people are surprised. So I think the image internationally has changed significantly. I think having a guy like Giannis, who's got an international profile, it draws attention to the city for sure. Again, the art museum. So it's changed. It's changed a lot. I think for the better.
Speaking of change, can you tell us about more about some of the changes to places you lived in Milwaukee?
Yeah, I don't think much has changed in Whitefish Bay. It hasn't changed too much from when I grew up there. I talked about the changes to the Third Ward, from really an industrial warehouse working district to really a neighborhood. There's enough residents down there, the condo and apartments, stores and retail, so that's made a major transition. I think the center of downtown along the river, there were a lot of empty buildings and dilapidated buildings. Every one of those buildings now is prime real estate, so for either retail or office or residential, so that's good. The Milwaukee public market certainly has invigorated the Third Ward. So those neighborhoods changed. The east side, I think UWM's expansion and enrollment has changed the east side, not always for the better. I think some of the old families that used to live around the university have probably moved out. It's student housing, but the east side still has a lot of the same feel, and in a lot of areas, still a lot of families on the east side, a lot of classic old architecture. So I think those neighborhoods have changed a little bit in that way.
And then just to finish this off, you said, we asked in the pre-interview about a story that, Just cut that out, Peter. Let's clap real quick. Let's go. Alright, in the pre-interview, we asked for like a particular meaningful story that you'd like to tell us, and you mentioned something about the EM Ford.
Yeah. So I mentioned our company, McCotter and Hanson at the time, we used to do a lot of boiler work for factories, hospitals, schools, and we also actually did boiler work on ships, Great Lakes steamships. So we developed an affiliation, or did quite a bit of work changing the boilers from coal, these old steamships on the Lafarge cement fleet, which was managed by Inland Lakes Management. So we converted the company, my uncle and my dad, converted these boilers on the boats from coal to number 6 bunker oil. So we had relationship both converting the boilers and maintaining them and working with the ship's engineers. So they had a fleet of 5 or 6. They had the Crapo, the Iglehart, the Townsend, the EM Ford, and the JB Ford were their 5 boats. And we converted, I think, 4 of the 5. But I remember it was Christmas Eve in 1979. I was 11 or 12 years old. The EM Ford was parked in the outer harbor at the dock, and it was Christmas Eve, so they were down to a skeleton crew, but there was a huge storm, and the boat actually was slamming against the dock, and it actually, they breached the hull, so the ship sunk just off the dock in the outer harbor. And I guess memorable experience because we had the boilers on the burners and boilers on the ship. They had to get the boilers going so they could get pumps to get the boat pumped out. So we had to, my dad had to deliver some parts to my uncle who was down in the boiler room when the ship was partially underwater, submerged, and on an angle. So we went out, as a kid I remember going out on the boat. It was one of the oldest, well, at the time it was the oldest operating steamship on the Great Lakes. It was half submerged, and it was winter time, so it was, at this point it was probably mid-January, and delivering parts, going with my dad down a hallway into the boiler room of this ship. They had stretched sand all over so you didn't slip, but it was a pretty unique experience to be in a shipwreck, I suppose, on the Lake Michigan in Milwaukee. So that was probably the most memorable and unique experience, but I think.
All right, thank you so much for coming in today. We really appreciate your cooperation with us, and have a good day.
Thanks.